Okay, so chapter 8 is called Eating and Sleep and Wake Disorders. So there are two major types of DSM eating disorders, and they are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, which are commonly just called anorexia and bulimia. These disorders both involve severe disruptions in eating behavior. People tend to be consumed with weight and shape and how it influences their idea of a self concept and how they view themselves and their lives. There could be a lot of fear or apprehension about gaining weight. And there's some strong sociocultural origins when it comes to eating disorders because it's a very westernized view of beauty, which is an emphasis on thinness. Another eating disorder that is also in the DSM is binge eating disorder or BED. And this involves disordered eating behavior that may involve fewer cognitive distortions about weight and shape than anorexia and bulimia, but it involves consuming large amounts of food. And obesity tends to be a big issue with binge eating disorder because it's considered a symptom of, um, of binge eating disorder, which is becoming much more prominent in society. So when it comes to bulimia nervosa, binge eating is a common characteristics, and binge eating involves eating excessive amounts of food in a short period of time, uncontrollably. And usually the foods are high in sugar, high in fat, high in carbohydrates. And then after eating, there's a lot of feelings of guilt and shame and regret that can lead to some other behaviors. And many people who suffer from bulimia or nervosa probably try to hide their behavior from their family members. It can also involve some compensatory behaviors, which is the idea that you have to make up for the binge eating. And the most common compensatory behavior for bulimia nervosa is purging, which is self induced vomiting or using diuretics or laxatives to get out the calories that were consumed. You could also have excessive exercise or fasting or food restriction. When it comes to medical features of the disorder, most people with bulimia nervosa are within 10% of their normal body weight. Purging methods can result in a number of different medical problems, such as tooth erosion, electrolyte imbalance, kidney failure, cardiac arrhythmia, seizures, intestinal problems, and permanent colon damage. So, lots of very severe health problems. From a psychological standpoint, most people with bulimia nervosa are overly concerned with their body shape and they have a fear of gaining weight. And they may even have some other comorbid psychological disorder like anxiety or depression. For anorexia nervosa, the main feature is excessive weight loss, calorie restriction. It may involve binging and purging, but that's usually related to being forced to consume food. Most people with anorexia nervosa are probably about 15% below their expected weight. There's an intense fear of gaining weight and losing control over eating. Most people who develop the disorder might first start out dieting and then it just spirals out of control. And there's a relentless pursuit of thinness. Some other associated features of anorexia nervosa is a disturbance in body image. People can also have other comorbid psychological disorders when they have anorexia nervosa, and it can as well be very deadly. It's one of the most deadly mental disorders because when you starve your body, it's going to deplete your organs and take your energy and lead to damage. It can also lead to heart attacks, and the results of that are devastating. And then binge eating disorder or BED was added to the DSM 5 and was not considered in the DSM 4 before 2013. So if you think about society, that probably speaks volumes about why this disorder is there. So this occurs when people binge eat, so they consume large amounts of food carbohydrates, sweets, fats in a small amount of time without doing anything to get rid of it. This is usually associated with distress and some other type of functional impairment. Many people with binge eating disorder or obese, some but not all, can have concerns about their shape and weight. They can sometimes be older individuals, much older than people who suffer from bulimia and anorexia, and more psychopathology is usually there versus the non-binging obese people. So when it comes to the prevalence rates and statistics of the disorder, people with bulimia are usually female, about 90% or more. Onset usually happens during adolescence. There's a lifetime prevalence rate of about 1% for females and 0.1% for males. 6 to 7% of college women can suffer from bulimia at some point, especially if those freshmen 15 come on and there's constantly focus on that. And it tends to be chronic if left untreated. Anorexia nervosa is also majority female, but also majority white, usually from middle to upper middle class families. It also tends to develop around early adolescence, and it can be more chronic and resistant than bulimia. The lifetime prevalence rate is about 1%. And then we also know that there's a few cross cultural factors as well that make this more prominent. It tends to develop in non Western women after they've moved to Western countries. So that speaks volumes about Western society. And then it's extremely rare in African American women. So think about what could be some of the implications for that. So when we start to think about the causes of bulimia and anorexia, we have to look and think about that integrative model. So we need to think about the media and how Westernized culture display beauty. Thinness is usually linked to success. It's linked to happiness. We have a culture that emphasizes dieting and an ideal body size. From a biological standpoint, we know that there's a genetic component and deficits in serotonin. That mood neurotransmitter may also contribute to binging. From a psychological standpoint, those who experience bulimia or anorexia could have a low sense of personal control and self confidence. They could be perfectionists. They could have a distorted body image and be preoccupied with foods and also experience mood intolerances. Other factors that might also interact and contribute to their eating disorder are dietary restraints, family influences, biological dimensions, and psychological dimensions. When it comes to treatment, once again, cognitive behavioral therapy is usually the choice treatment because it helps a person change the way they think, to then also change their behaviors and their feelings. And then also, usually, antidepressants can help reduce binging and purging behavior. But remember, as with all other medications, it's not going to be as helpful in the long term. When it comes to binge eating disorder, medications that were used for obesity are now not recommended. Once again, we want to use CBT because that seems to work the best. Also, interpersonal therapy as well as self help techniques can also work. Many times, people who suffer from binge eating disorder might be in an eating disorders group to learn some self help skills. Sometimes that's not as beneficial to those with bulimia or anorexia. The goals of treatment for anorexia nervosa is weight restoration first and foremost. We've got to bring the body weight up so that we can then work on other things like psychoeducation, behavioral and cognitive intervention. Oftentimes, family members have to be involved because it takes a village in a situation like this because you have to be of a good weight that you can still function and have energy. The long term prognosis for anorexia is much poorer than it is for bulimia. and there needs to be a focus on preventing eating disorders. So obesity is usually diagnosed when a person has a BMI of over 30. It is not a disorder in the DSM, but it may be a consequence of some of the disorders that are listed in the DSM. So in 2008, 33% of adults in the United States were obese and 37.5% in 2010. So that was kind of a drastic jump in a short amount of time. The mortality rates are closer to those associated with smoking as well, and it's also increasing more rapidly in children and teens. Obesity is also growing rapidly in developing countries. So if you think about why society is becoming more obese, I think we can think of a number of factors and lifestyle changes or lifestyle issues that are probably impacting that. Obesity and night eating syndrome. This is the idea that 7 to 9% of treatment seekers typically eat at night and are overweight. 55% of those individuals tend to seek bariatric surgery, and they try to consume one third of the daily calorie intake after dinner. They get up in the middle of the night, they're wide awake and do not binge eat. They're often not hungry and skip breakfast the next morning, and that can lead to obesity. So it's very important that people maintain a steady eating pattern. It's been said that obesity is related to technological advancements. Genetics can play a role in about 30% of cases, but we know that there are also some biological and psychosocial factors that can also contribute to the development of the disorder. When it comes to treatment, most adults are able to be a lot to work on things, but then you're going to have the children and adolescents who are the most successful. They're the ones who are more willing to change, and the success rate with adults is a little more moderate. The treatment progression can go from least to most intrusive options. So it's just really going to depend on the person and how motivated they are to change. The first step would be a self directed weight loss program. The second step would be a commercial self help program. The third step is behavioral modification. And then the very last step is bariatric surgery. So those are all the things I wanted to tell you guys about eating disorders. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and discuss some sleep disorders. So there are two major types of sleep disorders, the dysomas and the parasomnias. The dyssomnias and the parasomnias. Dyssomnias occur when a person has difficulties in their amount, quality, or timing of sleep. And the parasomnias are abnormal behaviors and psychological events that occur while a person is sleeping. So, before we really dig into this, it's important for us to talk about the importance of sleep. Just like eating is important to us because it helps us get fuel, it helps us go throughout our day, so does sleep. Just a few hours of sleep deprivation can decrease our immune functioning. It can cause us to have energy, mood, memory, concentration, and attention problems the next day. It could also bring on feelings of depression in non depressed individuals. And that can then have antidepressant effects on those who are depressed. So there are a number of ways we can assess if someone is having some disordered sleep patterns. And primarily, we can do that by looking at brain waves and eye waves and muscle movements. EEGs will look at brain waves and be able to tell if someone continues to breathe and function even when they're asleep. EOGs will tell us about how the eyes are moving and what that means for the level of brain activity a person is experiencing. And then EMGs will look at how, if the muscles are moving and if that's decreasing or impacting the quality of sleep in any way. So, whenever someone is having an assessment over their disordered sleep patterns, it's always important to get a detailed history, an assessment of their sleep schedule, their sleep hygiene, and how efficient their sleep patterns are. Sometimes people can wear portable devices that can help them monitor their levels of wakefulness and sleep as well as a means of assessment. So now we're going to talk about some of the disorders people who have sleeping issues could experience. Insomnia disorder is one of the most common sleep disorders. This occurs when people get micro sleeps. They have problems initiating and maintaining their sleep. It usually occurs in about 35% of adults who report daytime sleepiness, and it's only diagnosed as sleep disorder if it is not better explained by a different condition. Like if it's anxiety that's keeping you up, then that is a symptom of generalized anxiety disorder. But if it's no other symptom, no other disorder causing the issue, then it's diagnosed as insomnia. Most people, I think, when they think about insomnia, they only think of it as I can't fall asleep, but it also involves staying asleep. So if you wake up in the middle of the night, that is still considered insomnia. Insomnia can also be associated with other medical and psychological conditions. It tends to affect females twice as often as males. Some of the associated features are unrealistic expectations about sleep, believing that a lack of sleep will be more disruptive than it usually is. Here are those diagnostic criteria according to the DSM for insomnia. Here are the rest of those criteria. Here are some other criteria as well for hypersomnolence, as well as here. So, hypersomnolence disorder is sleeping too much or excessive sleep. And many times this also occurs with people where they have long nights of sleep or frequent napping that lasts too long. And there is a such thing as getting too much sleep. This is often associated with other medical and psychological disorders and is often diagnosed if other conditions don't adequately explain the sleep issue. And the primary complaint many people with this disorder complain of is having sleepiness throughout the day. Another sleep disorder is narcolepsy. And here are the diagnostic criteria for that. And here are the rest. And the remainder. So when it comes to narcolepsy, the principal symptom is a recurrent intense need for sleep, and there could be some lapses into sleep or napping without warning during waking hours. It can also be accompanied by cataplexy or hypocretin deficiency. And this is because when a person goes into REM sleep abruptly, very fast, they're really not able to go through the proper sleep stages. This is a very rare condition and that tends to improve over time but could have its onset during adolescence. It is equally distributed between males and females and only affects about less than half 0.16% of the population. Once again, those associated features that we talked about, that daytime sleepiness won't go away without some type of treatment. Sometimes there could be hallucinations because the person immediately goes into REM sleep and there's not the gradual progression through the sleep stages. Breathing related sleep disorders are three different disorders that were previously classified as part of the same disorder. So, first, there was obstructive sleep apnea, which is where people have airflow problems, but their respiratory system works. And then there's also central sleep apnea, which is when a person has respiratory symptoms that stop for brief periods. And then there's sleep related hyperventilation, which is when a person has decreased breathing during their sleep, but it's not better explained by another sleep disorder. So this one was really broken down because there are different ways that people could have breathing related sleep issues. Here are the diagnostic criteria for obstructive sleep apnea. Here are the rest of those criteria. Here are the criteria for central sleep apnea. And sleep related hypoventilation. So, when it comes to breathing related sleep disorders, some of the facts are that obstructive sleep apnea affects 10 to 20% of the population, which is a pretty large number. It's actually more common in males and often associated with obesity and increasing age. The person may not be aware of their apnea problems. They probably snore, they could sweat during their sleep and wake up frequently. They might wake up in the morning with a headache or feeling like they haven't slept very well, and so they sleep during the day. There's also something called the circadian rhythm sleep wake disorder. And this is when a person experiences disturbed sleep, which leads to distress and impaired functioning. And this is due to the brain's inability to synchronize day and night. So, our circadian rhythm is what helps us understand the difference between when we should wake up and when we should go to bed. So, if you've ever just naturally gotten sleepy at a certain time of night, it's because your circadian rhythm tells you that. And if you ever wake up in the morning without your alarm clock going off, it's because your circadian rhythm is getting you up at the same time. But there are some people who have a disorder where they can't synchronize day and night. And so their sleeping patterns are disturbed and different from everybody else. Here are other criteria for circadian rhythm sleep wake disorder according to the DSM. And here are the rest of those criteria. So, the nature of this disorder is the fact that the body doesn't follow the 24 hours clock. The brain's biological clock, which stimulates melatonin, is out of whack. And oftentimes, people who work shift jobs where they sometimes work at night, sometimes work in the day, this could happen to them. And then also, it could be associated with a family history of dysregulated circadian rhythms. So, when it comes to treating many of these disorders, medications are often used, but they can cause rebound issues, especially when it comes to insomnia. Many of those medications are available over the counter, but they also can be highly addictive. Also, medications can be used for hypersomnia and narcolepsy as well. For breathing related sleep disorders, there could be medications, weight loss, or mechanical devices that are used, such as a CPAP machine. And for circadian rhythm sleep wake disorders, there's usually some phase delays, like having the person just change their routine and moving their bedtime to a later um, time period, or moving the bedtime earlier as well. That can sometimes be more difficult for people to achieve. And using a very bright light so that the brain's biological clock will kind of synchronize. Cognitive behavioral therapy is usually the first line of defense for insomnia because it's about psychoeducation, changing how people think, about their sleep cycles and really developing good sleep hygiene. Relaxation and stress reduction can also help induce sleep. One of the other things that I learned a long time ago is, and this is something that a lot of people don't follow, is, one of the main criteria for sleep hygiene is to make sure that the bedroom is a place for sleep. And so that means you shouldn't eat in the bed, or even a big one is watching TV. Lots of people watch TV in bed instead of just going to sleep, instead of doing other activities. And for children, of course, they need a regular bedtime routine so that they can function. For parasomnias, the problem is not with sleep itself, it's with abnormal events that occur during sleep. So there could be things that occur during REM sleep and non-REM sleep. And REM is the dream stage of sleep, and non-REM sleep is non-dream sleep. So this is a new category as well in the DSM. It involves problems with sleep, such as sleep terror or sleepwalking. These used to be just separated into sleep disorders. When a person has a sleep terror, it's usually recurrent episodes of panic like symptoms. It's typically a childhood disorders, but some adults could have it as well. Same way with sleepwalking. The person will not have any memory of the event in the morning. When it comes to a sleep terror, the person shouldn't even be awakened because they honestly don't know what's happening. Here are the DSM criteria for non REM sleep arousal disorder. And there's the rest of those criteria. So, a few more facts about sleep terrors is that, like I told you, it's more common in children, about 6% more common than adults. Children cannot be easily awakened whenever they're having a sleep terror, and they're going to have very little memory of it the next day. So, there's no point in even trying to wake them. Usually, if you wait and see, the sleep terrors will go away. Sometimes, in severe cases, medications are used to help the child get better quality sleep. Sleepwalking disorder occurs during non REM sleep, and usually during the very first few hours of a deep sleep. The person might get up and leave their bed. It's also a problem that mostly occurs in children, and mostly people tend to grow out of it, although it does run in families. And it could be accompanied by nocturnal eating, getting up and going to the kitchen and having food. Here are the DSM criteria for nightmare disorder, and there are the rest of those criteria. So, when it comes to a nightmare, this is when a person has repeated episodes of extended, extremely dysphoric dreams that lead to distress or impairment. It's not really explained by other conditions. It's fear, extreme fear in the middle of the night. About 10 to 50% of children will suffer from a nightmare, and 1% of adults. It usually occurs during REM sleep, and the dreams will usually cause the person to awaken. And treatment also can be antidepressants or relaxation or not watching something scary before bed. Here are the DSM criteria for REM sleep behavior disorders. Here are the rest of those criteria. REM sleep behavior disorder is also new to the DSM, and this occurs when a person has a repeated episode of arousal during sleep that's associated with vocalization or complex motor behaviors. Um, this is often seen as a major problem because it could cause a person to injure themselves or the person they're sleeping with. So, as to summarize both eating and sleeping disorders, we know that eating disorders share common problems with food. They're heavily influenced by social, cultural, and psychological factors. Most are even driven by distorted thinking related to shape and weight. And all sleep disorders are going to involve an interference with our normal processes of sleep. problems waking up, and it can also be heavily influenced by psychological and behavior factors. Whenever there's an incidence of an eating or sleep disorder, we know that those things tend to be increasing over society. So we're always looking for more effective treatments for these disorders because we don't necessarily always want to rely on medications. I hope this information has been helpful to you in understanding the information in Chapter 8.